Kia ora and hello everyone. Good evening, good morning, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Elyjana, and tonight's talk is a collaboration between the Urban Planning and Design Department at the GSD and the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective. The Indigenous Design Collective promotes design by and for Indigenous communities as foundational to the history and practice of design. Thus, on behalf of the collective, I'm delighted to welcome you to this evening's Margaret McCurry Lectureship in the Design Arts, given tonight by Jade Kake from Aotearoa New Zealand. Before I introduce Jade, I'd like to remind our audience of some of the features you'll see in the webinar. Jade will respond to questions from the audience after the lecture. Feel free to submit questions into the queue at any time by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. We'll also have closed captioning available. To enable captions, click the live transcription button at the bottom of your screen. And before we begin tonight's program, I want to invite you to join us for some upcoming GSD public programs. Tomorrow, October 20th at 12 p.m, join us for a conversation between Emmanuel Christ, Christophe Gantebijn, Kirsten Geers and David van Severen, moderated by Jeanette Kuhl. And on the Thursday, October 21st at 6:30 p.m, theorist Jane Bennett will join us for a lecture on the radical entanglement of human and non-human activities. All events will happen virtually and require attendees to register. More information about these events, as well as how to register, is available on the GSD's website. With that now, it's my pleasure to introduce Jade. Jade Kake is an architect, a writer, a housing advocate. She leads a team at Matakohe Architecture Urbanism in Aotearoa New Zealand. She believes that the role of the architect and urban designer should be that of a connector, to be a skilled listener, facilitator, and interpreter, rather than the sole author and artist. Jade has a very active role in advocating for housing in Māori. Her book, Rebuilding the Kainga, Lessons from Te Ao Hurihuri, begin to explore alternative policies to achieve sustainable housing models for Māori. She also explores how built form through architecture and its arrangement in urban design can be driven by Indigenous knowledge. She's the recent recipient of the 25,000 Writers Award for a project that employs these ideas even further, where architecture can return a sense of well-being and belonging to people, and here Māori, that are estranged by colonialism. In 2018, Jade hosted the Indigenous Urbanism podcast, where urbanism through an Indigenous perspective is focused on place-based storytelling about the spaces we inhabit, the various community desires and practitioners who are shaping these environments, and essentially decolonizing through design. Jade and I are from the same nation, and in this I wanted to note how Jade's work is situated within a wider cultural context in Aotearoa New Zealand. The unfolding global events of the last 18 months have repositioned local matters concerning Māori. These matters are now at the forefront of a social dialogue in a way that has not always been as readily acceptable in the nation's colonial history. And this is to say that Jade's voice is very important to this conversation, not only because it responds actively in changing this context, but in fact, I believe spearheads a new generation of architects and designers that seek ways in which to give both the process and outcome of our built environments agency within Indigenous communities. These nations within the South Pacific, Australia being one of these, but equally other nations around the world, North America, Canada, that are each struggling within these same socio-political backgrounds. So with that said, it's my great delight, Jade. Kia ora, I'll hand it over to you.
Oh. Tēnā tātou katoa, ko hui mai nei I tēnei pō, I tēnei ahiahi, ki te whakanui e te kaupapa, e mihi ana ki te rungarawa, nāna nei I arahi pai I a tātou, e mihi ana ki te mana whenua me te whare rorohiko, ngā mihi ki te kaimahi o te kaupapa, te rōpū tauiwera, iwi takitiake o te kura, ngā mihi mō tō tautoko me te awhi, tēnā koutou, moiri ora, kia tātou katoa. Heoi anō, haere atu ki te kaupapa, ko Jade Kake tōku ingoa, he uri ahau no Ngāpuhi te Arawa te Whakatōhea, e tipu ake au I te rohe o te iwi Banjalang, e te taha o tōku pāpā do Horana ahau, e te taha o Ngāpuhi ko Ngāti Hau, te Parawhau, Ngāti Kahu o Torongaре, te Wairiki hoki o ku hapū. Ko pihi awari te marae, ko rewa me pihi awari o ku kāinga tūtaru, kei Whangārei ahau e noho ana ko he kai hautu o te kaupapa o Matakohe, hoa whare me te tōpū pā. No mai te whare, no mai te kaupapa. So for all of that, I know that not too many on our call probably understood what I was saying, but I thought it was very important to open with a mihi or an acknowledgement, and it's really just taking note of where we are today, thanking those who have brought us together, and providing a bit of an introduction of who I am. So Elyjana, you gave a beautiful introduction, and it's always so wonderfully flattering when other people introduce you. She's like, oh my goodness, did I do all that? So thank you, I really appreciate that. And thank you again to the organisers for inviting me to share some of our work and some of our approaches here in Aotearoa. So what I will do is I will share my screen. Give me one moment and share screen. There we go. Fantastic. Okay. So I thought I would, as I step through these slides, I'm going to give a little bit more context about myself and my work and our practice, Matakohe. And then I'm going to step us through 4 projects relatively quickly to give you a bit of a flavour of the kind of work we do and why we do it. And then I'm also going to briefly touch on a few publications and a bit of the writing work that was mentioned in the introduction. And I'll try to keep in mind as I'm using Te Reo Māori to also translate and explain what I mean, because it may not always be clear on context. I think we get a little bit, maybe not spoilt, but used to the fact that in Aotearoa, most people, Māori, non-Māori alike, have a sort of reasonable basic vocabulary. So I like to think that New Zealand English is becoming a Creole language. I don't know if that's quite accurate, but I think I really notice it when I talk to people overseas because they don't know what I'm talking about because I'm dropping so many kupu Māori into my, Māori words into my discussion. So we'll see how we get on. So here we are in Aotearoa, and so I live in Whangārei, which is where I'm from. But as I said in my intro, I actually grew up in Australia in Banjalang country. So I really like to acknowledge that because, my positionality when I was living there was quite different to what it is when I'm living at home on my own land. And I try and take that way of thinking wherever I go, whenever I'm going into someone else's territory. And so here's a zoom in of Whangārei. Those stars are just the projects that we're going to talk about. So they're all quite, close to the Whangārei central area. And I thought I'd just start with this before I got into the mahi side. And this is a collage of whānau or family photographs, because I think it's important to remember, for us, this is the reason for everything. Our whānau, our families, our hapū, which is our sub-tribes, they're the reasons that we do the work that we do. And it's a big thing underpinning our practice as well. And the one in the top left, that's my grandfather, and he was the most precious person to me. And so I often think of him between him and his siblings and, my cousins and my sister's kids, that they're kind of the beginning and end, and they're the reasons for everything that we do. So this is our landing page for our website, but this is our practice, Matakohe Architecture Urbanism, which I founded in mid-2018, really with a vision of bringing together our skilled kaimahi or workers who have been trained in the built environment and natural environment in particular, and how we use our professional skills to serve our own families, our own hapū or sub-tribes, our own iwi, and our community. And so I really had a vision of trying to bring those two worlds together, and nothing like it existed where I wanted to be, which was in Whangārei, which is where I'm from. And we're actually missing one person because we've grown again. So there's actually 8 of us now, but this is our team besides myself. And so we do have a mixture of, architectural backgrounds mostly, but also a bit of research and science, a bit of spatial design. And most of us whakapapa or have genealogical links up here to the north. And so the first projects I wanted to talk about is very dear to my heart. So this is Te Rewa, and this is one of our land blocks. So for a little bit of context, in Aotearoa, about 5.2% of land is in Māori collective title, which is a small amount given that it was 100% originally. But I think you have very similar experiences in North America. My family are very fortunate to still have land, and this particular piece of land is where my grandfather was born and raised on Whangārei Harbour. And actually, there's an island that's visible, maybe if I skip forward slightly. So if you look in that picture at the bottom, beautiful views over Whangārei, Te Rangaparaoa, which is our harbour, and there's an island in the middle, and that island is Matakohe, which is what I named the practice after, because one day I was standing on top of Matakohe, which was a tupuna pā site or an ancestral, defensive kind of village. And from there, I was looking out over the harbour, including at Te Rewa, which is the land that we're talking about here. And I really had this vision that in the future, things are going to look very different. And our kainga or our villages are going to be rebuilt, and it's not going to look the way that it does now. And so that tohu or that moimoia or that dream is what underpins the name of that I gave the practice. And so just to go back a step, I just wanted to start with a land use plan that we developed. So the forestry came down in 2012. There was forestry planted in the early 70s. And a big driver behind that was that the Whangārei Harbour Board and others were wanting to take our land, and our kaumatua or our elders, this was one way that they could envision retaining our land and not having it taken like so much else has been. And so when the trees came down, we didn't really know what was next. And it took us a little while to get it together, but I was asked by my family to lead the development of a land use plan. And so my cousin and I led that. And here we are doing some mapping with our whānau, looking over old maps and talking about where things had been in the past and what was important to us on Te Rewa. And then from there, we developed a short-term concept plan where we wanted to get the beginnings of our papakāinga or village built. And we also wanted to look towards some commercial development. And then the long-term plan, which is when we were looking towards a fuller papakāinga or village development and a fuller industrial development, as well as bush regeneration through the middle of the block. And because it was big sky thinking, I decided that the railway was gone and we could access our harbour directly again, which we could in the past. And so back to this slide, this was just to give a bit of context and also to show off our stunning views over the harbour. We're very lucky that this is our part of the world. And then these are some views on either side, just pointing out some of the important landmarks. And that motua taua, that's actually where the chiefs would gather to deliberate and discuss before they went and waged war on other regions or on other tribes. Not too easy to be overheard on that island. Some other stunning views. Apologies for the low resolution, but this was a workshop. So we did a number of wānanga with our whānau, both developed the land use plan and then moving into the papakāinga project proper. So here's just a shot of one of our workshop materials that we worked on together. And then, so once that land use plan was approved, we moved into the papakāinga project. And this was some of our early sketch thinking between ourselves and the landscape architects, worked up in a bit more detail. So it was kind of arranging housing in clusters, as well as providing consideration for views, shared spaces, gardens, looking after our wetlands, and thinking about the solar orientation. And then we started moving towards this more formalized cluster concept. One thing interesting that came through this process was discovering that the geotech for the southern slopes that are looking over the harbour was severely unstable, and that was where our homes were in the past. So that was something to work through with our whānau, because that was very unexpected, and that was sort of a challenging thing to navigate, because it meant the houses ended up on the opposite side to the views in the harbour. But I think we ended up with a good design outcome, because the houses are now going to be on the northern side, which is sheltered. And it means that the southern side with the views over the harbour has been opened up for shared use. So it's not being monopolised by any one family or any one house. And then moving through, this is our cluster concept for the first stage, and just thinking about how 8 dwellings might share a garden, might share a car park, some bins, and be sort of clustered together. And this is our final master plan so this project's actually at preliminary design stage. We're at a little bit of a stall, but there's been some new funding announced last week. So we're just trying to get that going again, so that we can work towards building consent and towards building these houses. And then just moving forward, this was just to show that they're kind of nestled in and try to follow the contours of the land. So they sort of not too much earthworks, but also you're not looking directly into your neighbour's house, because it's taking into consideration the contours of the land as opposed to flattening it out. This is another photo from one of our workshops, which is a reminder to take better resolution photos, but we're just so caught up in the moment, having a great time working together. But yeah, just reminds me in the future we should get some slightly better photography. And this is the design outcomes. This is a 5-bed whare. So there's a 5, a 3-bed, and a 2x2 bed duplex. And it's pole housing, using kind of natural looking materials, and working with the contours of the land. And I just wanted to quickly show the floor plans and point out what's kind of special about it. So we do have this arrangement whereby you can walk directly through the carport out to the back deck without going into the house. And there's also a toilet outside. And then there's also a line where you can close down the area with the bedrooms and the living space, so that if you have got visitors to your home, and you've got teenagers studying or kids watching TV, you can kind of, close that area off, and they can go about what they need to do without having to be kind of disrupted. And so you enter on the upper level, and the lower level has also got access from outside and is a sort of semi-self-contained. And it also has provision for like marae style sleeping, which is where you might all sleep in one room. And so there's the ability to store mattresses if you've got lots of guests visiting for a shorter kind of period of time. And then the 3-bed is on the same grid, but there's no lower level. And then there's a 2x2 bed duplex. And the idea is for all of these homes that the ground level is fully accessible for our whānau with disabilities, for our elders, and for anyone as their life circumstances might change. And these are a couple of sections through the building. And this is a fancy illustrated perspective. You can see the harbour and the mountains in the background, so you get a bit of a sense of what it might feel like to be here on this papakāinga. And there's a view from the inside, giving a bit of an idea of the look and feel. And then the next project that I was wanting to talk about is called Whangārei papakāinga, and this one isn't, the land is quite different. So whilst Rewarewa is harsh and it's coastal and it's scrubby, Whangārei's got a lot of old growth native trees. It's got beautiful volcanic soils, and there's a lot of water through the site. It's got a very different feel. So I just want to show this. This is our path plan, our colourful strategic plan, which set out all of our intentions and all of the things we wanted to achieve, and the papakāinga being a very important part of that. This is a map that one of my uncles did in the, I think the 1997 might have been the year. And it was like a memory map of all of the sites of significance at Pihiawari. And there's a lot there. We have a very rich history, but this map is a real treasure. This is just a couple of photos, just so you can get a sense. So this is the wetland area, our marae, which is kind of, for those who don't know what a marae is, it's sort of like your community centre, or it's the centre of hapū life, but it has additional spiritual dimensions. And so our marae is kind of at the bottom of this block in that triangle section, and then directly adjacent is this Pihiawari B1B block. So revitalising the marae and providing housing very close by is a very big part of the intention behind this project. So there's some photos of as we move through the block. Some of the water I mentioned that's running through. There's a number of streams. There's some open space, bit of gorse, and there's these amazing old dry stone walls. And this is the pond at the back, which fills up in winter. And so when we thought about master planning, this again is us and the landscape architects, we really focused on this kind of section through here, and clustering the housing up on the hill, but leaving a large portion of the block in forest and maybe some provision for gardens or small-scale agriculture. But we didn't want to make a lot of changes, and we also didn't want to have too many communal facilities. And why I say that is because it's right next to the marae, so we didn't want to do anything that would take attention away from the marae. So that really we see as the heart of any economic activity, any cultural activity, any shared activities. And this area is more focused on housing and the growing of food. And so this was worked up a little bit with some of the landscape aspects. So you can also see where the wetland is and the waterways. And then this was our first cluster. So there ended up being 2 clusters. And then this is kind of the final plan, showing there's sort of 2 clusters on either side of this gully. And we ended up with like I'm calling it a mega whare. It's a large house that is made up of 3 units. So there's a 2-bedroom kaumatua unit, or a unit for older people, could be for anyone, but it's fully accessible and would be very suitable for an older person. There's a 4/5 bedroom house that has a mezzanine that's semi-self-contained. And then there's a shared garage with a laundry and a bathroom, and upstairs is a 1-bedroom unit. And I don't know if these will be the final colours, but the idea is that it reads as one house, but you can clearly differentiate the different units. They each have their own identity and sense of arrival and entrance. And for the larger home, there's a big outdoor shared area that, you could either have one whānau, one family in this big house, and they share that communal space, but there's fire separation, acoustic separation, and enough privacy that if they weren't as closely connected, that wouldn't be a problem. They would still be able to occupy the individual unit. And why we came up with the solution is because in our wānanga with our whānau, they really wanted like big homesteads for 20 people, which is not the easiest thing to achieve with our fire code and with our district plan provisions. Our whole system is really set up more for a single nuclear family Eurocentric model of housing. And yes, that needs to be challenged, but I think this kind of gives you the best of both worlds, the ability to be compliant, but also have the flexibility to have a large family dwelling. And this is just the floor plan illustrating that concept. Again, as with the other project, the ground level of all of these is fully accessible. That living space is very large and deliberately separated from the dining and kitchen. So you could also have marae style sleeping in there if needed. And then just moving through, this is the upper level. We've got some lofts above the bedrooms, as well as that semi-self-contained unit, no kitchen in the big house, and then a fully self-contained unit with a kitchen above the garage. And there's a section so you can kind of see the double height space above the kitchen. And here's another section where you can kind of more fully see what's going on with that mezzanine and with that 1-bedroom unit. And here's a perspective outside, so you get kind of a sense of how it might feel. This actually increases the density a lot, but we wanted it to still feel rural and similar character whilst providing for reasonable numbers of people to live in close proximity to each other. And then this is an interior perspective, so you just get a bit of a sense of the look and feel. And you can see that lovely double height space with lots of light. Now, just checking on my time. Okay, I think we're doing all right. Our next project I wanted to talk about is called Oroku Landing. This one is, we're currently in preliminary design stage. So these drawings are all from concept design. Just to give a bit of context for this project, it was initiated by a private developer, community-oriented private developer in Whangārei. And they were wanting to bring an entertainment or an event centre to Whangārei. And there was also a vision for a hotel, a public plaza, and a mixed-use building that included apartments, parking, and some provision for retail. And there's also a boardwalk, and there is also a ferry terminal. And they managed to secure some money from the government to begin the design and feasibility work. And they also secured a commitment of, I think it's $60 million from central government to build this, but that was contingent on the local council or local government providing funding, as well as the regional council. So they want a commitment from other parts of government. For the local council, which is Whangārei District Council, they were only willing to put forward money if they could control the project because of their risk analysis or whatever that meant for them. And so since we finished concept design and moved into preliminary design, the council has taken it on board. They've put $1 million towards developing up to preliminary design stage, which we're involved with. Then they'll cost it. They've gone out for consultation with the public because it will involve a rates increase or property tax increase. And then from there, they'll decide whether they'll go ahead. If they go ahead, they keep the government money. If they don't, they lose the government money. But anyway, so it's quite a political project, but it could also be a very big deal for Whangārei because we're a regional centre. We don't have anything like this currently. So it could make a big difference for our region. So we were very supportive of the project from a hapū perspective. And so this project's a little different to the others in that we're not the main architect. The main architect for this project is Grant Harris at HB Architects. It's just a local firm just up the road from us, very senior and experienced architect. And we've been brought in to lead the cultural design integration and work with our hapū to identify the cultural narratives and concerns regarding tikanga or protocols and customs, and making sure those things are meaningfully integrated within the design of the development across architecture, landscape, and urban design. And so some of this, I thought it was a good example to sort of talk through some of the methodologies that we use. So these are not the principles we use now because we've developed a bespoke set with Ngāti Kahua Tōrangari, who are the main Indigenous group, hapū mana whenua here. But at this time, we used a set of principles called the Te Aranga principles, which some may be familiar with as a sort of placeholder to support the cultural design integration. And so we identified the landmarks that were important to Ngāti Kahua Tōrangari and also to Parafo as the neighbouring hapū who also has an interest in the site. And then we thought through what are the opportunities to begin to interpret these landmarks, narratives, and other cultural information into a design response. And then from there, this is some of the mapping we did where we looked at the PA sites, which is like your fortified defensible settlement, which are those triangles, Okara, Hihiawa, Orukura. Then we also looked at the waterways and we looked at some of the mountains around this area and started to use this sense of place as an opportunity to draw out design narratives. This helped inform the arrangement of buildings on site using some of those sight lines and those signal lines. And then the landscape architecture response has kind of been centered on three key areas. One is this idea of pauhiranga waka. So that's like a pole that you would tie your canoe to. And so this was a waka landing site. So this is somewhere where you would pull up your canoe historically. And so what we tried to do is to use those through the site and into the water as both a wayfinding device and also as literal po, hiringa waka that you could tie your waka to. So it's encouraging active occupation and use once again. And then the second design response is around the kupinga or the fishing net, the hand fishing net, and using that to create seating, like major seating elements that also work in tandem with these po. And then the final main landscape idea was around the planting palette. And so looking at pūrākau, which traditionally grows along the water's edge, which are these large trees with the red flowers. And then also thinking through how we could bring rongoa species or medicinal species that traditionally grow on Parihaka, which is the mountain that's above this site, and bringing them down into the project site. And here's the master plan that we ended up with. So you can see the event centre, hotel, mixed use building, a number of public plazas, the boardwalk, as well as the marina and ferry terminal. They're also investigating the bridge, which is kind of visible as an overlay there, but that's now being investigated in more detail. And then also looking at the architectural response. So the main architectural response was using woven patterns, or thinking about kete, which is our woven, I guess, baskets or containers, and relating the type of weave to the length of the occupation. So the idea is that the entertainment centre would use a loose weave or a kete kai, the kind of kete that might be used for food gathering. It's whipped together really quickly. You use it, you dispose of it. You don't keep, it's a quick thing to make. You use it briefly. You don't keep it for a long time. So we thought we'd use that for the entertainment centre. For the hotel, we were looking at a kete whakapuareare, which is like more of a medium weave with some looser parts, with the idea that the hotel's kind of medium stay. People are there for a little while and then they move on. And then the tight ornamental weave, we thought we would use for the apartment / mixed use building, because those people live there permanently. That's their home. And so we thought of it as a way to kind of unite this concept architecturally across the site, across the project, without the buildings needing to look and feel homogenous. And these are some of the earlier sketches of how that was manifest on the entertainment centre. This is the hotel, and this is the mixed use building. And then we're not into detailed design yet, but in preliminary design, we're starting to further develop some of these concepts in collaboration with the main architect and the landscape architect. And these are some of the renders from the concept design. So you can see the mixed use building in the foreground and the hotel further in the background. And then here, this is the entertainment centre with that loose basket weave pattern, as well as these kupinga hammocks adjacent to the boardwalk. And then Whangārei streetscapes. This is the last project that I wanted to talk through. So this was a master plan for the Whangārei central area that we developed in collaboration with Isthmus. So Isthmus is a big landscape architecture firm. They were the lead on this project. We asked them at tender stage if we could join their team, because we saw that the brief really didn't incorporate working with our hapū, didn't have any Indigenous dimensions. So in a way, this was an advocacy exercise, because our council failed to think about us in this process. And so we went kind of through the consultants who were awarded the tender, and through them were able to introduce a number of really positive dimensions that weren't in the original brief. So I think it was a good outcome, but I hope that it was also been a learning experience for our council to think about talking to mana whenua hapū and not only the Chamber of Commerce, who they were planning to talk to. And so my cousin and I, Nike, who works with us here, we facilitated a number of workshops with our hapū, and from that came a series of design principles that applied to the whole master plan and design guide, and also preferencing the te reo name, which I thought was quite good, And the main consultants were very supportive and really empowered us through this process. We also mapped out where our sites of significance were relevant to this plan, both contemporary and historic, and broke those down into a number of themes. And then and so this was just kind of setting out where they were across the project areas. The project area is the red dotted line, but we decided to take it further than that. So we mapped the sites that we thought were relevant. And I think that I had them in the wrong order. So this is actually the one where we mapped out our aspirations. So we started with the site significance and then set out what our hapū would like to see. And really it's about bringing those sites of significance and names and habitats, things that are important to us, bringing those to the surface so that they're visible in the design of the city. And some of those are sort of relatively simple things, and some of those will take a lot longer, like if you're daylighting streams, but it's all oriented towards strengthening our relationships with place and healing some of the damage that's been done. When we do this cultural design work, I really think about our young people in particular. And so do they see themselves in their rohe, in this environment? And how can we use this environment as a way to teach them the stories of their ancestors and teach them about themselves, and to continue on those practices of our tupuna, of our ancestors, those living cultural practices? How do we make them normal in the city area and not only on the margins? So that's part of what this project was about. And then the last thing, I think I'm actually going pretty great guns for time, so that's nice. The last thing I wanted to talk about was just some of the projects that I've been involved in or have used. So there's a range of resources here that some I've contributed to, some I haven't, that I think are really useful. Although they're Aotearoa specific context, I thought it might be of interest to this audience because I've had a number of conversations with our practitioners in Canada, US, Australia, and a lot of them are looking towards some of the methodologies and approaches that have been successful here, and then how they can kind of learn and adapt from those, as we are, likewise looking towards other settler colonies to learn what strategies have been successful and what we've been able to achieve. So the first one is Auckland Design Manual. So I was very involved with getting the te aranga principles onto that design manual and getting te aranga as a methodology well integrated within Auckland Council policy and process. Mana whenua and Tāmaki are in a process of re-evaluating te aranga, and maybe te aranga principles isn't the way to go anymore, but the idea when this was put in place was that it's a set of 7 really tangible principles that provide a starting point for integrating cultural values within the built environment, and in a really tangible outcome-oriented way, because there'd been previous attempts to kind of think about cultural intangibles and then translate that into built environment outcomes. And it was quite difficult for non-Māori practitioners in particular to grasp and then also to support the implementation of. Matakohe, which is it's Ngai Tua Hurere, they're the mana whenua of Christchurch or Tautahi. They were made a partner in the rebuild through the Christchurch earthquake recovery legislation. And from there, they developed Matakohe Trust, which is the official entity that's charged with all the cultural design integration work. And there's some really amazing examples as a result of that rebuild and their role in it. But they have done a few things which I found very inspiring. One was developing, I guess, their official narratives that they, working with their historians to identify and write up what their official narratives are, and then also developing urban design guidance. So they've got a really great urban design guide that comes from their context that is worth looking at. And then this papakāinga guide, that is hopefully going to be updated soon. So working with Kāinga Ora, which is the new Housing New Zealand public housing entity, although it has a much wider mandate than that now. But they commissioned this work back in, I think, 2001. We did a cosmetic refresh in 2014, and it really sets out design guidelines for Māori housing, taking into consideration whānau dynamics and family configurations, as well as tikanga or cultural practices and preferences. I use it all the time in my own work, but obviously things are changing. We're starting to look at medium density housing and apartments, which weren't previously conceived of, and maybe kind of new in the Māori housing space, although there's historical precedent for it, pre-colonization, early contact. And so really just thinking through how our culture can adapt and respond to those to ensure that the design of our housing is culturally fit for purpose. And then there's a few guides that have been prepared, one by my iwi of Ngāpuhi, Te Matakohe, the Ministry of Māori Affairs, and also there's been a joint initiative by the various councils around Te Tai Tokerau, which is my region, and they all have different strengths and different value to bring. And then this page, I just wanted to list the first few because I used them quite a lot when I was doing my master's thesis, and I think they're still great resources. So there's the community participation methods in design and planning by Henry Sanoff, Chief Kerry's Moose, which I use to understand, cultural mapping. And we're doing quite an important cultural mapping project in the practice, which is led by my cousin, Nikki. And I think so she's well exceeded me in terms of GIS mapping and cultural mapping methodology, but we're continuing to develop that. And this was a bit of a starting point for me when I was growing to understand it. And then there's a few other resources, both internationally and from Aotearoa. Particularly want to recommend the Our Voices 1 and 2 book. So they've been a sort of joint initiative between Indigenous designers and academics across Aotearoa, United States, Canada, and Australia, and others, but those have been the kind of core editorial team. There's a third one on the way, which I didn't contribute to due to time, but I contributed to the first two, and there's heaps of great content in there. And it made me quite excited because I think we're collaborating on books now, but maybe we'll start collaborating on buildings next. I also, before I go on from this slide, I can share this around and maybe that can be emailed out, but I've developed a bit of an Indigenous urbanism reading list, which I think includes all of these texts, but has a lot of others as well that might be of interest. This was mentioned in the intro, but I just thought I'd plug this book that I wrote. It's kind of an economic think piece, but and not a design text. But I think it's kind of represents my best thinking at the time, and I think it's quite interesting. And I did look specifically towards policy and land tenure in North America to try to think through what are some lessons that could be useful for us here in Aotearoa. Haven't really talked to anybody from the United States or Canada about, if they've read the book, whether there's lessons in the other direction, but I like to think that there would be. So hopefully that's of interest. And this was mentioned as well, Indigenous Urbanism podcast, place-based storytelling podcast, where we go to a bunch of different projects and interview amazing people and learn about them. And there's also some longer form interviews with practitioners. This came out in 2018 and we did 24 episodes. Me and my cousin roamed about the country. It was really fun. I'm trying to find money to do another season because people keep asking me, but it's a little bit expensive to do a documentary style podcast and pay your technician to record and then edit everything and mix it properly. Is even if I'm willing to give up my time for free, I still got to pay people. And so check it out if it's a useful resource. I think there's some really good stuff there, including some international content. And if anyone, just somehow happens to have any connects to any funding or people who would like to fund a great Indigenous design focused podcast, do get in touch. In the meantime, I've just been trying to access our local funding for podcasts and recording, that kind of thing in Aotearoa. So we'll see how we get on. And there's a nice photo of me and my cousin interviewing Paura Sheeran, and he's championed a lot of papakāinga projects around the Hawke's Bay and is a real tohunga expert in that space. And I'm going to stop sharing. And I think that might be pretty much time. So I'm gonna stop talking.
Great, thank you, Jade. Thanks for sharing your projects and the work that you've been up to. It's nice to see it all in one place because I know that you've been doing a lot, and to see it all succinctly presented is refreshing. So now we're going to open this time up for discussion. So while people send in their questions, we have some others join us. Also, we've got Dan Dioka, who teaches at the GSD, and some other members from the Harvard Indigenous Design Collective, Grant and Zoe. And I know that my colleagues here will have some questions for you, Jade. So perhaps we can kick off with Grant. Would you like to?
Thank you, Jade. That was a fantastic presentation. It's so exciting to see that the work that you're doing in New Zealand. My first question is about your work being situated around kainga.
Grant, your microphone is blurry. No, it's still blurry.
I can give it a go. I just hope I haven't misinterpreted. It was a little hard to hear. So I'm just going to rephrase what I thought the question was, and then hopefully it's the right one, and then I'll answer it. So I understood the question was around, so much of the work is focused on kainga, or our villages, and so how do those, what's the relationship between them? And I'm thinking especially like adjacent kainga or hapū, and then what might that mean in a sort of contemporary urban sense? Is that more or less the question? Okay, great. All right, well, I'll hopefully I haven't paraphrased too badly. So, I mean, traditionally there was a really, and this is still true to an extent, but it's been very disrupted by colonization. There was a real careful relationship between neighbouring hapū, and it's based on access to resources as well as stewardship of land and resources. And so if you're a coastal hapū, you've got access to food resources from the ocean. If you're an inland hapū, you might have access to tuna or eels. You might have access to kukapa or wood pigeons. So you've got access to different food sources, and you might need to pass through somebody else's territory to get to that other food resource. And so it meant that you had to have strategic relationships, which included things like strategic marriages to ensure that you wouldn't come to any harm, and you could maintain access to those food sources. And so that's true to an extent now, but it's obviously we're living in a modern colonized world, so it's a little bit differently. I should note that although a lot of my work's been around revitalizing kainga, there are places where they've had continuous occupation in various forms. And so just wanted to acknowledge that for some, they've always been on their kainga. For others of us, it was a papakāinga, it was a kainga, and it's dwindled to one homestead. And then we had town planning laws come in that meant we couldn't continue to live at that intensity or rebuild at that intensity. So town planning has a lot to answer for, and why we're not living in our villages. I think it's also worth mentioning that marae, which I talked about a little bit, are they're the centre of community life and spiritual life. But that complex configuration is kind of come about in a way as a response to colonization. And so it didn't look, even though the sort of functions are the same, traditionally that would have been at the centre of the village. It wasn't the whole thing. And also the sizes of our houses have enlarged, and we've, brought in place new materials, and, a lot of things have changed, and our culture is responsive and can be adaptive, but I think it's worth thinking about what we've changed in response to, because we can also change again in the future in our kind of decolonial journey. When it comes to more urban spaces, I think it's not a simple question, because some of our most densely populated areas, that's somebody's territory. There are mana whenua hapū there, but they would have thin numbers on the ground. So they might be a much smaller percent of the population. They have, if they've settled with through Treaty of Waitangi settlements, they might have some statutory provisions that give them, powers over certain things, relationships with government agencies, co-management of certain, things like reserves. They might need to be consulted on certain things. There are some statutory provisions, so they've got a role, but it's not the same as having your land back. And, you know, treaty settlements sometimes return a bit of land, but it's maybe 1 to 3% of what was lost. And so it's kind of, when you're demographically swamped, it's quite difficult to, I guess, fulfill your role. So when you're, you know, mana whenua hapū, you have a responsibility towards looking after the environment, so environmental stewardship within your area, the maintenance of food resources, you know, not overfishing or over gathering something, making sure the levels are healthy, environment's healthy, people are healthy, but also you've got a responsibility to those that live in your area. But when you have no control over it, it's quite difficult to exercise that. And we don't have resources, it's difficult to exercise that. With all that said, there are some fantastic examples in the urban environment. So the kainga up at Ōrākei, Takaparafu, which is the kainga of Ngāti Whātua Ōrākei, they've embarked on a really fantastic program of, you know, building houses, homes for their whānau, and rebuilding their kainga. And for those who aren't familiar with New Zealand history, you know, there was the land marches of the 70s and the not 1 acre more after almost all, they were down to quarter acre or something, that, you know, almost all their land was taken. So it's been a big move to go from almost no land left in the biggest city in Aotearoa to having a kainga back on the hill there, and having reasonable influence over what happens in the city area. And they do own, I think, quite a bit of the CBD. I don't know that really comes across visually, but I think Ngāti Whātua ki Ōrākei in particular own a lot of the land. And so a lot of those buildings on the waterfront are leasehold. And when you look at other cities like Rotorua, you know, Ngāti Whakatōhea in particular, which is one of my hapū, gave up a lot of land for that township, but also Ngāti Whakatōhea owns a lot of that land. So it's, I don't know what I'm trying to say here. I guess I'm saying it's an evolving space, and in some places it's visually, you know, apparent, and in some places the mana whenua do own land and have control over what happens. In other places there's less control and it's less apparent.
I've got a few questions here, Jade, and I want to kind of group some of them together, but one is referencing what you were discussing earlier on in your response to Grant, in terms of how do you actually plan for like tikanga Māori, what is the relationship with things such as nature and sky and water? And then in terms of the homestead, how would the architecture have changed if it wasn't responding to the Eurocentric building concept? And those are some questions from CJ and Daniel.
I'm going to answer the second one first, because I think it's really interesting. It hasn't been my area of focus, but I've sort of watched it closely, and I'm very interested in how we develop in that space. So, you know, traditionally our building materials were not meant to last for a long time. So we used things like raupo and nico, and you know, dug into the earth when it came to pā. So we've got some really sophisticated engineering when it came to, you know, defensible structures. But all in all, that wasn't meant to last for a very long time, not like stone or anything like that. But as we moved into a more permanent form of housing, and there was less kind of seasonal movements, and obviously colonization happened, so we started moving towards adopting those building materials, as well as using the resources available here, which is timber. You know, obviously we moved away from that. But I think some of the interesting areas of research and resurgence around hybrid materials, and how we start to combine traditional materials and techniques with more contemporary materials and techniques. And I think, you know, our people are great innovators, and that's still true. So I kind of think that's what would have happened. There's already really great examples where we, you know, started building printing presses, and we had ships that were trading with Sydney, and these were all things that were happening kind of early contact. And so we had, you know, like, I think Māori society was highly literate. You know, we had printing, you know, we had newspapers in Te Reo Māori. Like, there's all these incredible things, and, you know, it pays to know your own history. But, you know, so I think if we were allowed to continue on that path, we would have just incorporated the new technology and made it better and contextualized it for Aotearoa. And I'd love to see that still happen. And I forgot what the first question was. I think I didn't fully understand it, so I moved to the one I got. Could you just rephrase that first question?
I've grouped a question from Daniel T, which is, how do you plan for nature, like our relationship with those beings who reside on the land, skies and waters. And then this also relates to Emily's question, which is, what are some of the ways that your team works through the process of incorporating cultural heritage intangibles into the design of the built environment? And I think those questions are related to each other.
Yeah, so I think with the cultural intangibles, I mean, a lot of it is around process. So we work really closely with our elders. And so really they're the ones to guide us around what are the cultural aspects that are important to the project or whatever it is that we're working on. And then we bring our kind of knowledge of architecture and the planning system and that Western world into the conversation to support a solution that is fit for purpose culturally. This is, I don't know if this is a great example, but I wasn't there, but my cousin went on this science thing anyway. But it was interesting because one thing that came up with some of the elders that she was talking to was around what is the tikanga of acoustic. Like if you're, if something you're saying is getting kind of captured, is it getting trapped? If it's a karakia, is it getting trapped? If it's something that has a cultural significance, what does that mean when you encounter acoustic treatments that either capture that sound or block it or reflect it? And I actually don't know the answer, but I just thought that was an interesting discussion. And I guess the main thing for me is I don't need to know the answer, but I need to really rely on my elders, and it's for them to wānanga or deliberate to understand what it actually means from a cultural perspective. And then we're kind of the foot soldiers out to implement. And so we can help with that wānanga because we've got some technical knowledge, but I guess always acknowledging, because of our culture, where our Māori society is structured and the way that we've been taught, it's not for us to decide. We're not decision makers. That'll be us when, give us another 50 years, 40 years. I don't know how long have we got. And I probably should try to answer the other question, although I don't fully understand it.
I think you've answered it.
Okay.
With what you are saying now, I think that perhaps like the ability of what we can do is work within policy and understand that in a way that maybe kaumātua or our elderly doesn't have the agency that we have at the moment. So that it relates to this question by Ramil Moises, who is a graduate student in land use planning at the University of the Philippines. And he's asking, how do you specifically work within the legislative authority of your town, especially on policies that will affect the community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I'll try not to get too into the detail of how it works in Whangārei, but I keep it a bit more relevant and transferable. But in New Zealand, we have got a resource management system, and our primary piece of legislation, although it's not the only one, is the Resource Management Act 1991. We're currently going through a reform overhaul process that will result in 3 new pieces of legislation. There'll be the Natural Built Environments Act, there'll be the Strategic Planning Act, and then there's a Climate Change something act. And so those 3 pieces are kind of being worked up now, and there's been some consultation, but it's really going to move us from a effects-based resource management system, planning system, to outcomes oriented. And there's also some other planning tools which won't change, which are things like national policy statements. And so those are central government directives that then local authorities, generally district councils, need to implement. So a recent example was in our urban centres, was to remove restrictions on, building heights being below 6 stories, I think, and then also removing some minimum parking requirements. And so when things like that come out, the local authority has to incorporate them into their plans on a set timeline. So that's a bit about the planning context. Hopefully that's useful. In Whangārei, so in the north, we've got Te Tai Tokerau, which is our region. We've got a regional council, Northern Regional Council, which is kind of responsible for what, I guess, like anything kind of crosses those boundaries. So it could be things like waterways, and maybe they've got things around earthworks, and also anything impacting the ocean. and I'm probably misrepresenting their roles. They do a few more things, but mostly land and water. And then there's 3 district councils. So there's a Kaipara district, Whangārei district, Far North district, and they all have slightly different rules, which is annoying. So I'm in Whangārei district, and we've got a we're pre-settlement. So I don't know if anyone's too familiar with Treaty of Waitangi settlements, but it gives you a bit of money, a bit of land, and some statutory provisions, which means that you'll have bespoke legislation, which means that government or the government has to work with you or take you into account on certain matters. We don't have that in Whangārei because I belong to an iwi that has not settled. And so that can make it a little bit difficult to assert our rights in our region. But anyway, moving on from that, what we do have in place, we have an advisor, it's a standing committee between Whangārei district councillors and hapū representatives, which I sit on, called Te Kārerea, and that group has got some delegated authority, which is kind of helpful, and then the main council is able to delegate further authority to that standing committee if they see fit. And then there's also a bit of work around liaison with hapū directly, but it could use some work. And so I guess it means that our council, which used to be extremely racist, is on a journey of being less racist and more responsive. And that keeps improving, which is great, really encouraging, both at a council level and at a staff level. And so more often they are coming to us directly. They have a better sense of who to come to, and they're seeking to involve our hapū in projects as appropriate, and be responsive through the resource management system as well. So we also have, our system also accommodates things like hapū environmental management plans, which they're meant to take into account. And there are some good statutory provisions, but the problem is if the staff aren't equipped to interpret them, then they sort of, a lot of it's discretionary. So they've got a lot of choice about what they kind of do or don't take on board. So it's a lot about kind of treaty training for the staff and getting them on the same page and committed to this. And so they actually talk to us. So there's probably a longer answer than needed, but some of it's policy and some of it's legislation, some of it's policy, some of it's relationships, and some of it's just that broader cultural change towards, anti-racism work and decolonization. And I think that's probably true in a lot of places.
You briefly mentioned the Treaty of Waitangi, and Jess Lim has a question here, which she's saying, "Hi Jade, thanks for your presentation. It's deeply encouraging to hear the work you and your colleagues are doing. Could you speak to how the Treaty of Waitangi, as a founding document for Aotearoa New Zealand, provides a different starting point for the reintegration of Indigenous design principles into the urban fabric, as opposed to other nations like North America? And how has the treaty helped you at all in your work in the negotiations you've had to undertake in advocating for Indigenous design?"
Oh, that's a cool question. Okay, yeah, let's do some Treaty 101. So Te Tai Tokerau Waitangi was signed by, rangatira or chiefs of sub-tribes hapū and representatives of the British Crown in 1840. It conferred a number of rights and responsibilities upon both groups. But to back up a step, in 1835, rangatira of Ngāpuhi and other tribes issued He Whakaputanga, which was the Declaration of Independence, is the English translation, which was really identifying that we're sovereign and we have our rangatiratanga. And then in 1840, it was kind of a complex political environment, but a big driver behind Te Tai Tokerau Waitangi was that the British subjects were a bit out of control. And so it was an opportunity for the Queen of England to get her people and set some laws for them, so they weren't just living lawlessly, doing whatever they wanted. One of the problems that's happened since that document is that there was an English version that the British treated as the authoritative version, but it's not the version that was signed by rangatira, and the translation isn't accurate. And so something that happened that was quite important was that we had Te Paparahi o Te Raki, which is a Y1040 inquiry, which was for our historical claims within Ngāpuhi, which is my iwi. And that found unequivocally that rangatira did not cede sovereignty with the signing of Te Tai Tokerau Waitangi, and that only the Te Reo Māori version is authoritative and legitimate. We're pushing really hard to have there be some follow through on that finding. So the Crown have said that, yep, that's the case, but they haven't said how did they illegally assume sovereignty, and what are they going to do about it now that they've acknowledged the truth of this. And that's part of the reason actually that Ngāpuhi haven't settled, because we want to see a pathway for our stage 1 finding. The other piece of the puzzle is a kaupapa called Matike Mai, which was led by some of our foremost Māori thinkers such as Margaret and Wana Jackson, legal scholars, really impressive people. And they led this, I guess it was like a wide consultation project to identify, a future constitution for Aotearoa, because we don't have a written constitution. Many consider Te Tiriti o Waitangi to be our kind of de facto constitution. But what they wanted to see was, well, what would be the pathway towards transforming our system of government or national governance to reflect those 2 foundational agreements, He Whakaputanga and Te Tiriti o Waitangi. So really interesting stuff is happening in that space. And so then to jump to how that might apply to design, well, Te Tiriti o Waitangi is an international agreement, and so it really only exists in Aotearoa as it's reflected in domestic legislation, and it is increasingly being reflected in legislation. And so we ended up with the Treaty of Waitangi Act, I think that's the right title. Anyway, in 1975, where we set up the Waitangi Tribunal, and that enabled historical breaches. At first, it was only there was a time issue when it was first brought in anyway, but they changed it to incorporate historic and contemporary grievances, and it meant that breaches of Te Tiriti o Waitangi could be taken before an independent tribunal, which could make non-binding recommendations, and then there's a settlement process. And so, as previously mentioned, a number of iwi around the country have settled. The most long-lasting settlements were, in the 90s, I think, or the early 90s. And so what that means is that, yes, you get some money, yes, you get some land, which is typically 1 to 3% of what was lost. It's almost nothing. But you also get a range of statutory provisions, either through bespoke legislation or through other pieces of legislation. And then also things like the Resource Management Act and this new legislation that's been brought in to replace it, they reference Te Tiriti o Waitangi as well, which is quite important. One point of contention is that often these government documents, including laws, reference the principles of the treaty rather than the articles. Which is sort of a made-up government thing that seeks to water down the power of this foundational agreement. But I'm pleased to report that there was a government strategy that was released last week, which is the Māori housing strategy, Mahi Ka Ora, and that even though it's not a piece of legislation, it specifically references the articles, which is pretty groundbreaking. So we just keep agitating because we want the actual text of Te Tiriti o Waitangi and the actual substance of the agreement that our rangatira signed to be reflected in legislation. And we want this large-scale transformation, constitutional transformation that's been envisioned by the Matike Mai process. And I didn't actually talk about how that's been helpful. Sorry, one last point on that long answer and then I'll be done. So for instance, because Ngai Tahu had settled in the South Island, when the earthquake legislation was brought in as part of the earthquake recovery, it was because of that treaty settlement that it triggered the ability to make Ngai Tuahuriri, the hapū, mana whenua hapū of Ōtautahi Christchurch, a partner in the rebuild. And if you look up Matapouri Trust, or if you look up some of the work that's been done in Ōtautahi, you'll see some really amazing manifestations of cultural narratives and sense of place relationships physically in the built environment. And so I thought that one is a really good example of how treaty settlement provisions, linking of legislation, linking in with on the ground outcomes, plus all the things that would have happened in between to get to the point of having built stuff. But anyway, okay, hopefully that answered it.
No, that was wonderful. Thank you, Jade. So my name is Zoe Toledo, a member of the Navajo Nation. And in hearing you speak also and talk about your projects and the emphasis on land, communities, and as you just recently talked about, treaties, the politics of recognition, the effort that it takes for Indigenous culture to persevere and be recognized in the built environment. For me, seeing this and hearing you talk about this in your work, for me, this resonates as Indigenous design. There's an emphasis in thinking about kinship, about community, about this relationality that's just more so than people building architecture, that there's this interrelation connection to it all. And at the center is land. So I kind of wanted to ask you, Jade, like when we begin to think about within architecture, within design, what do you identify as like settler design practices? Are there key traits of a settler design practice? And how does that differ strongly from an Indigenous focused one?
Thank you for that. That's a cool question. By the way, I've been to Navajo Nation once on my exciting tour that I did through Canada and the US, and we went to Window Rock and Nageezi as well. And I probably said that wrong. Anyway, it was a really cool experience for me. So I'm relatively ignorant, but I had an amazing drive through and spent a bit of time being hosted. So I'm a little bit familiar, but I was shocked to discover it snows there because it was the middle of summer, and they were telling us about, how the building accommodates snow. And I was like, oh my God, why would that?
Right.
Yeah. Okay, but I should answer the question as well. So I think it's interesting, this idea of settler design and framing it as such, because something that's happened, maybe it hasn't been talked about in this way, but something that's happening in Aotearoa is that we're really seeing this strong, and it's probably been happening since the early 90s, a strong emergence of Pākehā as a political identity, and it being actively, which is, Pākehā relating to those descendants of original British settlers for the most part. So it's a very specific political relationship. Identifying as Pākehā and seeing themselves in relation to Māori and seeing their identity as being very actively decolonial. And so everything they do has to be in support of rangatiratanga and honouring that foundational relationship. And so I think what I'm seeing is there's an emergence of settler design approaches that are more coming from that perspective. And I want to differentiate that because I think that is absolutely what we want to see, but also is different to colonial architecture, which is seeking to kind of erase those previous relationships and create and reinforce and legitimize colonialism. And I think we see that in kind of some of the celebrations of heritage, and that heritage is just colonial architecture and nothing before that. I like to think that way of thinking is dying out in this country, but I saw it very strongly when I was in Australia, and I see it very strongly other places. Okay, so once making that distinction, I do think one of the things that really, differentiates Indigenous approaches to architecture is that it's more process orientated than outcome oriented, and it involves really close listening and engagement with the land and those layers of cultural history. And those characteristics of the land that might not just be physical, but also spiritual and metaphysical, and that it also involves through wānanga or through other kind of culturally structured ways that might happen in a specific cultural setting, engaging community in an Indigenous form of a co-design process. And I do think there's parallels with some of the sort of socially progressive, human-centered kind of design movements that I think are relevant, and I found that interesting. But the big difference is really it's coming from our cultural perspective, and it's centering people, land, and process.
No, thank you for that response, because as like an Indigenous student going through the GSD and encountering architecture in different shapes and forms, just like your emphasis on process really kind of resonates with me, and thinking about those land-based narratives that are tied to like people and community. I'm just kind of a bit curious, like in your work, do you feel like that understanding comes very intuitively to like other settler practices or institutions you engage with? Or do you feel like it takes a little bit of work to bring people to that understanding? Yeah.
It takes a bit of work. So something we've maybe not joked about, toyed with, thought about whether we require it, is for any of our clients and their nominated design teams on some of these projects where we're being asked to bring the hapū lens or bring the Indigenous perspective, is that I almost want to make them go through a mandatory course just so that they're at the beginning line of having a productive conversation. I think that sometimes the cultural knowledge is shockingly low, like really, so then you're ending up doing a lot of Māori 101 or Indigenous 101 and sometimes there's a really well-meaning people. Sometimes people's egos get in the way. I think architects have a problem with that. So maybe it's an endemic thing in the profession, or maybe it's because most of the profession is old white men. But sometimes people don't want to let go of themselves as this brilliant designer. And how very dare you tell me I don't know something? I could do it just as well as you or better, and I don't want to incorporate your way of thinking or your input. And we do get that, and I don't think that's the main response. I think more often we get, both in terms of the client and in terms of who might be the main architect on those collaborative projects that we're brought into, often they're just very ignorant. And so they, but I can work with ignorance if the goodwill and the genuine intent is there. So if they want to do a good job and want to get it right and are willing to accept that they don't know anything in this area, even though they might be knowledgeable, very knowledgeable in another area, then that's great. We can work together and have a productive relationship. But yeah, sometimes I just think they need to either put their people through a mandatory program or pay us more, because it's we end up doing a lot of hand holding and a lot of just really basic stuff to take people on a journey and get them on the same page. I did want to add something actually relevant to that. So something that's happening at the moment is there's 60 competencies for architects that it's a document developed in Australia that links in with a bunch of other MOUs, including with United States and Canada and a bunch of others. Anyway, but New Zealand, because of our size and the scale of our industry and so on, our registration board just picks up that document. But what's since happened is that some of our colleagues in Australia have been incorporating a new version of this document, incorporating Indigenous competencies around working with Indigenous communities, relationships to land. There's a few really important ones in there, and the language is quite specific to Australia. But now what we've been asked to do is to support our registration board with an amendment to contextualize it for Aotearoa, but it's going to have a huge impact because that relates to the way our programs of architecture are accredited, and it relates to the way our architects are registered as architects and demonstrate that they're competent. So these competencies were never in there before, and so I'm hopeful that the kind of things I'm complaining about to you right now and saying are still happening, especially with our old school architects, that won't be true for the future generations, because they'll go through culturally responsive programs and then they won't be able to register unless they're culturally competent. So look forward to seeing it.
Yeah, I can just jump in there and say that is actually happening in Canada as well through the landscape architecture profession, that we're looking at working with the schools and improving competencies and how that might be part of the accreditation process. But my next question for you is about how you've spoken about your interdisciplinary work, writing, podcasting, and advocacy as laying a groundwork for the type of practice that you have presented here. And I'm just wondering about your long-term vision, perhaps a generation or two from now, as some of the struggles that you're presently dealing with have been overcome, in how you envision Maori culture being reflected in the built environment more broadly.
What a hopeful, aspirational question. I love it. So the first part, I do think that, all of the speaking, writing, policy submissions, talking to the media, that all came about really because the type of work I wanted to do would be quite difficult to do without those ground conditions. And a really important mentor of mine has been Joe Hoskins, who's one of our foremost Māori architects and also a whanaunga relation of mine from Whakapara. And so it was actually him that first got me involved in all this advocacy mahi. And so at first I sort of questioned it because I'm just trying to be an architect, come on. But, he got me involved with a lot of things. And I think because he understood the passion that I had for this work, but also much like what he has been doing alongside his practice, mahi, and his design work, is we need to advocate so that the type of work we want to do for our communities actually can exist, because it won't exist if the district plan provisions don't allow for it, if the funders don't fund that kind of work, if there isn't a widespread understanding of the value of this type of design, then it won't get written into business cases, and all of these things have an implication. So it might be nice that I want to design some papakāinga, but how can I do that if we don't have the ability to get it consented, or we don't have the ability to leverage resources to do the work? And sorry, the second part, that part's really exciting. I think I'd love to see us have our land back. I often think about this decolonization thing, and it's more complex than that, but I think at its minimum, it involves return of land, return of control of resources, as well as transfer of decision-making power. And those three things are really necessary if we're genuine about decolonization. And I think that's happening in a variety of ways in this country. I think there's a lot of really exciting stuff happening, but also reason to keep agitating and keep advocating. So in the future, I'd love to see, you know, our hapū actually having land in our rohe and it being returned to hapū ownership. The system that we have now is quite fragmented and based on shareholding, and that was all as a result of historic legislation designed to alienate Māori people from Māori land. So there's been some efforts to repair that, but that's not a simple thing. So we want our land back. We want to be able to remediate the health of our environment, whether that's, you know, the health of our wetlands, whether it's, you know, daylighting streams and having them be swimmable and God, even drinkable. Wouldn't that be amazing? Restoring our harbour, ensuring that our food sources are healthy and well managed and can be eaten because they're healthy and well managed. You know, and these things will all take time. It took quite a bit to degrade our environment, but I think that's at the foremost for a lot of our hapū is for those things to occur. We'd also like our people to return home. And so I'd actually, if I'm thinking of architecture, I'd love to see approach to architecture where it's our, you know, we're in control of the consenting and it's not a Eurocentric model, but it reflects our cultural practices and preferences and dynamics. I'd love to see us building with these hybrid materials that we mentioned. I would love to see this collaborative relationship with our tohunga whakairo, like our carvers and our artists, and, you know, that be a really normal part of how we practice. And so maybe the discrete role of architect as we know it won't be relevant, or maybe it will be different. I do think architects are more facilitators than anything and being able to synthesize everything from the various inputs from different professionals. But I do recognize that a lot of our role is a bit of a translating role where we're trying to get what our community wants through a consenting system. But we're also trying to integrate our cultural values. But a lot of it is getting through the regulatory system. So if that changed, what would that mean? And I don't really have an answer to that. But I guess I'd like to see our people in control of our own destiny and for our own people to be doing that work.
Jade, there's two questions here that I'm going to try and combine together, and we have a couple more minutes left. And it's how do you think these design principles could apply in other places like the USA or Canada? And then as a parallel to that, with somebody who's familiar with a landscape but might not have an Indigenous heritage or background, how can they approach engagement in designing spaces in a thoughtful way?
Well, the first one, I might, oh, there's a fire truck driving past, sorry. Okay. There's a fire truck driving past. Yeah, so I might do a bit of a plug for the Our Voices book, because the Our Voices Volume 2, there's a chapter in there that Jackie, Paul and I put together, which is specifically looking at Indigenous design principles and understanding how we've developed in our context and talking about how they could be applied in other contexts. But just to summarize, the most important thing is not to pick up something from elsewhere, but to work with your own tribes, with your own elders to determine what's important for you. A lot of those lessons will be transferable, particularly around how methodology to integrate those cultural values into and translate them into built environment outcomes, as well as how to integrate them into policy settings, particularly at a local government level. And so some of those things are transferable, but I think the actual cultural basis for all of that work needs to be local and contextual, and it's no good to pick up something from Aotearoa because it won't be appropriate. And I don't know if that needs to be said to an Indigenous audience, but I know that there's been a lot of interest internationally in what we've been doing here, and maybe from well-meaning people thinking, let's just pick up te aranga somehow, which is just, isn't appropriate. But there's some transferable lessons for sure. And then the second part was, what was the second part? Oh yes, if you're not Indigenous, team up with Indigenous designers if you can, I think, as a first port of call. And then second to that, if that's really not possible, because I know that not every area has that critical mass, still look towards whoever the local Indigenous group are, forming those relationships and thinking of yourself in a supporting position. So I think understanding your positionality and role is really important if you're seeking to do that kind of work.
We're coming up to 8 o'clock. Maybe we have time for one more question. Does anyone from our discussion panel want to ask something? Or
certainly don't want to have the last word or the last question, but I do want to say first off that I really admire, Jade, how optimistic you are about the future generation of architects. As someone who teaches here at the GSD, I share your optimism. Although let's face it, architecture will always have an ego problem, right? So thanks so much for your talk. I really appreciated it. I did again, I don't want to have the last question, but I am really curious to hear you know, in what ways you're thinking the Te Arana design guidelines, because I have to say, you know, I had the privilege of teaching a studio with the Squamish Nation in British Columbia, and all the people we worked with there were keen to single out the Te Arana design guidelines as the kind of gold standard, and they kind of aspired to it. And I hear that again and again. So if there's a really short answer to that question, I'd love to hear. What's wrong?
There is.
How are you rethinking them? Yeah.
The important thing is to think of Te Aranga as a methodology and not focus on the principles. So methodology is adaptive and can be contextualized. Principles make it sound quite rigid. And what's the problem has been here is, one, those getting hard baked into policy and procurement processes without being appropriately contextualized or being able to be adaptive. And then the second thing is overworked consultants on tight timeframes, being forced to engage with them, but without having the time and resource to do it properly. So then they just kind of pick it up and have a go themselves without actually forming the foundational relationships, because that's seen as adding time and cost. So if you want to add kind of culturally relevant processes, you cannot just expect to stick to your same program and budget and just jam these in there and hope for the best. All it'll mean is that your consultant teams pick them up and use them inappropriately because it's been required, but they don't have the ability, especially if you've required it, but you haven't actually engaged people that are competent to engage with cultural context or able to form the relationships that are needed. So I guess those are some of the words of caution, really.
Thank you for that.
Well, that brings us to our time. Thank you very much, Jade. We really appreciate you, and we hope you all enjoy the rest of your week.
Thank you again, everyone, for the invitation. This has been wonderful, and I hope those listening got something out of it, and just really respect the work that you all do, and thank you again for inviting me to be here.
Ciao.